arrive. Okay. I think I'm going to kick off. Great. So welcome, everyone. It's such a thrill to be here today. My name is Colleen McClintock, and I'm privileged to lead the OD team at Omnicor. And I will be hosting the webinar today and supporting all of you here in the session. While we're talking, please just drop in the chat for us where you're from, what company, and then also what made you sign up for this webinar. We're so curious to know. So it's interesting to be here because this webinar started just as a casual conversation. Coral, remember, we were looking at her internship program, as I'm sure you all do too. And we were like, oh, job profiling. And then I chatted to Cathy and we thought, well, you know, there must be quite a need for all of you IOPs to get this kind of knowledge. So we decided to do an experiment, which is why you are all here. And the spirit at which this webinar is being brought to you is just through one of generosity. We're here to support your growth. We know the kind of resilience it's taken for you to get here. And we hope that this little mini kind of program is going to support your learning, not just as a tick box exercise, but really one that will set you up for success for your career. So these skills are very hard to come by, actually. In fact, Cathy and I were speaking about them becoming more and more rare as AI sort of takes over automating this. And I think you are going to be very surprised at the skills that you learn and how you'll be able to apply them going forward. So that's our intention, is that you should get the knowledge that you need and that we should support your internship and your program requirements. Just a little bit about the structure. So remember, this is a bit of an experiment. So what we thought would work is for you to get the foundational knowledge, and it is a lot. We're in a 2-hour block over here. And yes, you do come with a lot of knowledge from your degree, but this is very focused on job profiling. So we're going to do this. Cathy's going to do the foundational knowledge with you. We will take a little housekeeping break at 2:20, just so that you can be aware of that. So that we can step away from the webinar for 10 minutes. And then, you know, the foundational knowledge is a lot and you're going to learn a lot, but actually the real work starts when you need to apply these skills. So you're going to work with a partner. You will be assigned a partner after the webinar and you're going to do a real job profile. And trust me, if you watch Cathy do a profile, it looks like, what's the big deal? It's an easy thing to do. Job profiling is a real art and it's very, very tricky to job profile. So once you get your practice with your partner and you submit your job profile for feedback, you're probably then going to have a lot of other questions, which is why we've set the follow-up session for you to bring further questions. Cathy can help clarify little things that you maybe struggled with. And that's overall how we put together the structure. I mean, when Cathy runs this workshop, I mean, it's like a 2 full-day workshop. It's very intensive. So we are trying to put a lot in this program for you and to support specifically your IOP needs. If there are other individuals in the room that are not, you know, an intern, that's fine. I'm sure you will still get a lot of value from the session. So just before I get into introducing our guest, I would like to acknowledge Coral. Coral is our IOP intern, and I just wanted to mention that she has done a lot of the work behind the scenes putting this together with such warmth and kindness, and working with her during her internship and watching her grow in confidence and skills has been a real pleasure, which is probably why we do internships at Omnicor. So Coral, thank you so much for everything and making this session possible. Okay, so I was saying that job profiling is an art, and we have brought the artist to the room. Let me introduce Cathy Farlam. Cathy is an entrepreneur extraordinaire, and in fact, Cathy is the co-founder of Omnicor, along with her husband, James, and is currently a co-founder and lead partner at Multiplex Partners. If we've got a job profiling gig or something complicated and hard, Cathy is who we call. Cathy has built her career at the intersection of people, organizations, and strategy with deep experience in organizational development. In fact, Cathy, I don't know of anyone else who works as hard as you do. You seem to just work nonstop, and your experience is incredible. I've also personally had the privilege of learning from Cathy, learning the art of job profiling, and also just a mentor in general, and a very good friend to Omnicor, both James and Cathy. And Cathy, you bring your sharp, thoughtful communication into every human interaction you have, and I'm sure this group is going to benefit as much as we have over the years, learning from you and getting your skills where we need them best. So over to you, Cathy.
Colleen, thank you. That's a very fulsome introduction, and I feel very moved and touched and very grateful to have been invited, grateful to meet all of you, and excited for what we're going to do this afternoon as we talk through role profiling. So thank you so much, Colleen, and thank you so much to Omnicor as well. Great. So we're going to have just under 2 hours. We've got until 3 o'clock this afternoon. As Colleen says, we will be having a comfort break halfway through. So at 2 o'clock, we will take a break for 10 minutes, just so you can have a bit of a loo or just a quick bite break if you need. So don't, just in terms of pacing yourself, do know that there will be a break so that you don't have to log out. We also will be, Coral will be sharing the slides with you after the session. We also, as we go through this and as you think through what it's like to do a job profile, if you've experienced job profiling before, if you have questions, please put them in the chat. Coral is going to tell, we'll work with us behind the scenes afterwards. We'll draw up a slide for you, a slide or two for you of what those questions are, and we'll just bullet point some answers for you. So the purpose of this really, there is some practical background knowledge which is really useful, but the purpose of it really is to be able to support you with both the capability and the confidence to go away and feel like you can build your own job profiles. And of course, AI is useful as well, but if you don't know what you need to get from AI, it's significantly less useful. So that's also another opportunity here in terms of really understanding what the structure of a good role profile looks like. Coral then at the end of the session we'll put aside 5 minutes just to take you through the assignment, and then we meet again in 2 weeks where we have an hour just to talk through your actual experience of it, questions you had, insights you had, and if there's anything that you need to support you optimally going forward from there. So let's start. So Colleen did say that if you can put in the chat what motivated you to attend this course beyond it being an internship requirement, and also if you can put in the chat, if you want to, anything that comes to mind for you in terms of how you hope to use role profiling in the future. And it's because when we're looking for how we do role profiling is because we do the most brilliant assessment with the most brilliant tools. But if your recommendation for the role is not aligned to the expectations of the role, it's wrong. And that's where we realize that good assessment also then talks to being able to put together a good role profile that really nails what's particularly critical in the role. And I've got an example right now where I'm assessed a CFO for an organization, and on the job spec they said they wanted somebody strategic, creative, big picture, dynamic, etc. And the weakest candidate actually is the one they like the most. And actually when they've thought about it, they realize that they actually don't need a candidate operating at a very strategic level. They do want somebody who's more detailed, more dogged, more in the detail. And if they hadn't, if we'd had a different job spec up front, we would have been able to shape our recommendations differently around that. So just a little bit of nuance also around why profiling is you actually cannot do a good assessment without having a good updated role profile. So we're going to be looking at three things here. So we're going to be looking at the context, just briefly spending time on the context of role profiles. Where does role profiling fit in? Why is it in fact so important? And why is it important to be able to create a role profile that guides all aspects of the HR or the people value chain? Because I don't know if this is your experience, and it's certainly ours, that often when an organization is advertising for a role, what they'll do is they'll quickly go into one of the Gen AI tools and they'll ask it, and they'll come up with the job spec that they can advertise for. And then they often never really look at it again, other than to come up with the, possibly that, which they'll ask ChatGPT as well, what are the interview questions? But in fact, and we're going to talk a bit more about it in the context, and I think it's one of the most important points that I would really invite you to take away from our webinar this afternoon, is that a good role profile is at the heart of the whole HR value chain. Yes, Colleen, I'm seeing your hand up.
So sorry, Cathy. The sound is a little bit fuzzy, and I'm wondering if you want to switch off your camera for bandwidth. Maybe that will help, because we're struggling to hear a little bit.
Are you okay? All right. Let me switch off my camera.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
All right. Okay. Thanks, Colleen.
You're on mute now.
Sorry, let me switch off my camera, not my sound. Sorry, switching off my camera, not my sound. Can you hear me better now?
It sounds a bit better. Just keep going.
Yeah, it does sound better.
Sounds a bit better? Okay.
Yes,
okay.
thank you.
All right. Okay. So, as I was saying, one of the most important points that we, would potentially be particularly useful to get out of this afternoon session is that role profiling is at the heart of the whole HR or people value chain. So in terms of, if we think of the top of the HR value chain being where attracting the right talent. So, right from attraction through to selection, recruitment, selection, development, career pathing, engagement, retention, remuneration, rewards. Your role profile, ideally a good updated role profile, sits right at the heart of that. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we come to the context. Then we're going to talk just a little bit about the theory. We're going to look a little bit at levels of work and how it links to Patterson grading as just one of the grading systems. But of course, you can then from that link it to most other grading systems as well. And then we're going to end off by spending a good bit of time looking at how you apply it. And we've got some information for you. Yes, Colleen?
Oh, sorry, Cathy. The slide is not moving. Are you on slide 2 now, or have you moved?
I'm on slide 2. Yeah.
Oh, fine. Okay, fine.
I'm on slide 2. Can you see? Yeah, I'm on slide 2.
No problem.
Okay, perfect. And then we're going to go into application. Okay. Doing this afternoon. Okay, let me now go forward and see. All right, so we're starting with the context. So we're saying, what is a role profile? Now, interestingly, a role profile is not the same as a job description. It builds on a job description, but it's not the same as a job description. So a job description typically has what has existed in organizations for decades. And it's typically a long list or a short list of what the activities are in the role. It's very activity heavy, a job description. What a role profile does, because it's at the very heart of integrated people practices, right? And therefore at the very heart of talent management as well, is it includes success measures or KPIs so that these can then be linked to the performance management process. It includes the underlying mission critical competencies. We're going to talk a little bit more about that later. It includes typically the level of work. So I'm sure many of you know level of work through the CPP or the CPA, those tools. I want to talk to you a little bit more about that a little bit later. And it can also, and ideally would include some elements that talk to what does the role look like in your organization. So ideally, you would also include the values, maybe the vision, the mission, these kinds of things. So that also when you, for example, advertising for a role and somebody wants to see the job profile, they're understanding where that role fits within the broader organizational context. So yes, it does look at skills, knowledge, and behaviors, but it also looks, as we say, at the role's complexity level as well. And the idea is, and particularly actually, now that we're in an increasingly hybrid and remote world, job profiles, a good job profile has become more important than ever before, because so much of what was expected in a role typically was learned quite informally and on the job. Now that that's not happening, it really gives people, for the employee, for the staff member, gives them such a lot of firm ground to clearly know what is this role, what does good look like at the right level, what are the core competencies, and how does that all link from a development perspective, from a performance management perspective, from a rem and reward perspective, and also very critically from a career pathing and succession perspective. So we know, as much as in SA, unemployment is high, but at the same time, there's a shortage of certain critical skills. And we know also how long it takes to build institutional knowledge and for people to really settle in a company and a role and to fit the culture as well. So we do want to ideally, and I don't know if your organizations have a kind of a goal around that, but we do ideally want to be, building people from within. Yes, Colleen?
Sorry. I just need to address what's going on in the chat. And maybe, David, you can also assist. So, Cathy, I don't know if you've moved your deck. Some people are not seeing it, and for me, I'm seeing slide 2. So I'm just struggling.
You're not
there's
seeing
lots
slide
of requests. 2? Yeah, I'm seeing slide 2.
I tell you what, let me stop sharing.
Okay.
And share again. Let me just see. Are you still seeing it? Are you seeing it? Is it?
No, it's gone now.
You're not. Okay, let's see. Okay, stop sharing. Let me just start. I'm going to start seeing if we can share now again. Can you see it?
Let's give it a minute. Nothing. Oh, there we go. Okay, so we're on slide 5. Can you all see that?
It says, what are role profiles? Yeah. And let me go now to what job performance is about. Can you see that slide?
Oh, yes, lots of thumbs up. Good. David, you wanted to say something?
No, all good. Okay.
Sorry, Cathy. So sorry, Cathy.
No. Technology, it has moods like people. We never know. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. Just let me know if you can't see, and I'll tell you when I'm changing the slide. I'm going to tell you when I'm changing the slides, so you can let us know if you can't see it. Okay. All right. So to go back to it, just to talk about role fit, right? So when we think about somebody's fit for a role, we are not just talking about the fit in terms of technical skills, knowledge, years of experience. We're also talking about the person having the right competencies at the right level, the behavioral competencies, and we're also talking about their ability to live the values and have a positive effect on the team and culture. So these 3, we call them the 3 legs of the table, that if you're looking at evaluating anybody for a role, either somebody that's bringing in from outside into the role, you're looking to promote them, or from a performance management perspective, you're looking at giving them feedback on how they're performing in the role, you would talk to these 3 elements. So people can be very degreed. For instance, they could have, PhDs, they can have MBAs, they can have all kinds of wonderful things that have taken them, a lot of smarts and grit to get. But if they can't come into your organization, into a particular team and apply those skills in the right way, the right level, and if they can't do it in a way that takes the organization forward positively, then they are not fully succeeding in the role. So ideally, part of your role as R&D consultant, as industrial organizational psychologist, is to support you understand, and as I say, if I think about the situation where we didn't do the job, we just did the assessment, but it really brought home to me, again, thinking about meeting you today, it really brought home to me that we cannot do a good job from an assessment perspective unless we've really understood what the expectations are in the role. And so, it doesn't necessarily mean wanting everybody to be level 4, 5 of the CPP, or wanting everybody to be strategic, creative, etc. Lovely competencies, but they requires, for example, a much more concrete, detailed level 3 thinker, for instance. Yes, Colleen.
I'm so sorry, Cathy. Sorry, we can't hear you. The sound is very bad.
That is so strange. Let me move. No, you can't see my head then. That is extremely odd. I wonder what is happening today.
Wi-Fi is not stable because it's
the
Wi-Fi. I think there's something with the Wi-Fi. I know we're all struggling with Wi-Fi at the moment, but you're not in South Africa at the moment, are you?
No, I'm not in SA. I'm not getting a message about my Wi-Fi though.
Okay, now it's better. What you're doing now is better.
Now it's better?
Yes.
Okay, that is extremely strange. Okay, so normally, okay, let's see. I'm wondering what's happening with my Wi-Fi. It's not saying that it's struggling, but let's see. You're not hearing me, so something's obviously happening. Yeah. Can you hear me now?
Perfect. Whatever you've done is perfect, and maybe we'll just monitor it. What did you do?
I just jiggled the thing.
Okay, let's hope that's what it required. Thanks, everyone.
That's what it's required. Cathy. Okay, apologies. I have, the technology can make us more nervous than anything else. Okay, so I'm hoping you heard me about these three, looking at job fit from 3 perspectives, right? Looking in terms of technical skills and knowledge, looking in terms of the behavioral competencies, which is how we apply those skills and knowledge at the right level, and also the ability to live the values and have a positive effect on the team. Okay, I'm going to change slides now. I'm hoping that you can see it. Can you see it? Has it shifted?
Not yet, Cathy. Not yet.
No, it hasn't.
It hasn't? Okay, let me go back. Now?
Yes.
Yes. Good.
Okay, that is also, who knows? So, most of you, I'm sure, will know this. This is what's called the Gallup Q12, the 12 questions that most predict people's or organizations' ability to engage and retain staff. So, of course, there's been a lot more research done. And you'll know Omnicor has a very powerful engagement survey as well, and there's a lot of work's been done. But this work that was done in the late 90s is still at the heart of any good engagement process. And it's interesting because if you look at it, and we've highlighted for you here the questions that particularly talk to role profiling. So what Gallup did, just to give a little bit of background here, what Gallup did was they asked hundreds of thousands of people a whole range of questions, hundreds of thousands of people all over the world, a range of questions to understand that if we take the housekeeping factors off the table, in other words, paying people correctly and having decent working conditions, etc., what are the factors that most predict how happy and engaged they are at work? And it came down, as you know, to these 12 questions. But if we just look at how these questions talk to a good role profile, a good relevant role profile for what the role looks like in the organization, right? We've got Q1 here, the first question, I know what is expected of me at work. I know what is expected of me at work. So a role profile clarifies that, right? At work also, I have the opportunity to do what I do best every day. So that also helps people align what they're good at, what they love doing with what the role requires. There's someone at work who encourages my development. So development would be, if we don't know what good looks like and we don't know what progress looks like in the role, we can't develop appropriately. So a good role profile will guide development in that sense as well. Also, the mission and purpose of my organization makes me feel my job is important. Now, that's a little bit abstract. You may or may not choose to put your organization or your team's mission or vision onto the profile. But interestingly, in terms of the success measures and KPIs, so where we add KPIs to that document, it shows, it gives the person an indication not just of what they're doing, but of the value that they are adding in the role. Similar question 11, talking that in the last 6 months, somebody's spoken to me about my progress. So that could be in relation to taking on additional responsibilities in a current role, but it also could be from a career pathing and succession perspective in terms of looking at taking on a more expanded role. And if you've got a role profile for that expanded role, that conversation can be so much more practical and tangible. And then again, linked to development. In this last year, I have had opportunities at work to learn and grow. So that talks also very much to what then came out of performance discussions, particularly in terms of identified gaps and the investment on the part of the company and the commitment on the part of the person to close those gaps. So I'm going on to the next slide. Can you see here? Are you able to see the next slide here?
Thank you.
Okay, so this slide then talks to a little bit what I was saying to you earlier about the HR or the people value chain, right? So a good role profile guides all of these aspects. It guides recruitment, employee development, performance management, career pathing, succession, etc., employee engagement, compliance and standardization. And it's key also to making sure that you've got a good organizational structure and what we're increasingly coming to refer to as the leadership cascade. That everybody's, in fact, even if they're not leading people formally, we're all leading ourselves. And you'll see in the competency framework that Carol's going to share with you, we talk about the manager's self, manager's others, manager's competence, manager's business competencies. And if we're able to kind of understand, what's important at those different levels, we're then able to get that leadership cascade working well. I'm going on to the next slide. Can you see it? Can you see see this next slide?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, good. So this is very important because you will know that the Labour Relations Act says we're not allowed to discriminate against anybody from a work perspective on anything other than the inherent job requirements. And so when we talk about that does describe, and if we think about our intersecting three circles, right, our three legs of the table, if we can define and describe very clearly what's required in a job, then we can very fairly make good hiring decisions, good, fair, non-discriminatory hiring decisions. We can also promote people internally based on those decisions. And of course, if it comes to a PIP, where people land up being put on poor performance, if you have a signed and relevant job profile, you're on much firmer ground in terms of any potential legal aspects emanating from an improvement process. So it's interesting, a job profile primarily is an organizational development document. It's primarily used, as I say, at the heart of the HR value chain to guide good and effective people practices. But it also, if it goes to, if something lands up going to the CCMA, for instance, it can become a very material piece of evidence from a legal perspective as well. Okay, so who's involved in profiling? So this is a very important discussion, and it talks to one of the second points that I'm hoping you'll take away from this afternoon's webinar, and that is that it is very important to profile the role, not the person. And one of the big things that bedevils role profiling is we tend to profile, because we tend to profile with incumbents in the role, we tend to profile what the person does, what that person thinks is important at the level, and not necessarily what the organization needs in terms of the role. And for that reason, I mean, there's different ways of doing the role profile, but typically you would want somebody from HR in that profiling session. You would also want the manager there, or you'd want ideally a blend of incumbents, maybe 2 or 3 people in the role. If the manager cannot be in the session, then it would be very important that they review the document afterwards and that it's sense checked with them before it's signed off. So the actual role profile that you create with the incumbents is not the final role profile. That is the draft role profile that would then get verified, reviewed and verified by the by line management and of course HR as well. So in a really good role profiling process, what you've got is you've got all 4 of these people involved. You've got HR involved. You've got some current incumbents, 1 or more current incumbents. You've got the hiring or the line manager. And then you wouldn't have senior leadership typically in the role profiling session, but it would be important that they at least glance at or understand kind of where that profile fits in terms of the department as a whole, and particularly for high impact roles. And be careful also, people often profile or emphasize what's important for them in the role or what sounds kind of exciting and interesting. So it's very important to also, and this is where our levels of work lens comes in that we're going to look at in a minute, it's very important to understand, if this role is at a particular level, what are the themes of that particular level that we're able to make sure that the profile is aligned accordingly. Okay, I'm changing slides, hoping it does it. Can you see we're going on to competencies?
Yep.
It's shifted, fantastic. I don't know what happened there.
When you jiggled it, it all came back. It's all good.
Yeah. It's this undersea cable. I don't know what it is. Yeah. Okay, so what is a competency, right? So we talk about, some people talk about technical skills, some people talk about technical competencies, but typically when we refer to competencies, what we mean by it is behavioral competencies. So behavioral competencies are the generic sets of behaviors that can be applied typically potentially across all roles and across all levels. And the library that Coral will send you, you will see we've used just one of the 40 competency libraries rather than overwhelming you with 60 or 90 competencies. But you can see, you'll see that those are the behavioral competencies. So those are competencies like problem solving and quality orientation and drive and planning and organizing. So these things are potentially needed in all roles. So those are our behavioral competencies. And behavioral competencies have an attitudinal aspect to them. Beyond skill, because you've also got to then be able to apply it in increasingly ambiguous, unstructured, new contexts. So, for example, if we think about a technical competency or a technical skill is typically a trainable knowledge domain. So if you think about Excel, for instance, Excel is a skill. How you apply Excel to achieve a special result or to add value, that then talks to your analytical thinking, your drive, your quality orientation, your teamwork, depending on what the particular application of Excel is. So the technical is something that you could go on a course to understand, but then how you apply it then talks to more of these behavioral competencies. And here is the list of 40 that we've given you. And feel free to add your own as you build your own competency library. So as I say, you ideally don't want to make it too complex. But the nice thing about these 40 behavioral competencies is that they're clustered for you under these different headings. So I was speaking to you about managers self, managers others, and managers business. And you can see we've got the thinking competencies, innovation, systems thinking, problem solving, analytical thinking. We've got the self-management, the intrapersonal competencies, right, that talk to drive, ethics, learning agility, objectivity. These are not necessarily things that you can see in how, in how people interrelate with others, but if you experience them for a period, then you start to see the extent to which they consistently display these competencies. We've got our relating competencies, we've got our leading and managing competencies, and we've got our generic functional competencies here. So some of these functional competencies are either buckets that would hold a whole lot of technical skills, or they're the sort of generic application of something where there's a variety of approaches in terms of how you'd apply it. So for example, business acumen, there may be a whole lot of skills involved in business acumen, but we are here talking about somebody's ability to make decisions that grow the organization whilst identifying and managing risk. And you can see project management there as well. I mean, it's both a technical skill or competency and a behavioral competency, but I think increasingly, even if you're not Prince2 accredited, or in one of the project management methodologies, I think the philosophy and framework of project management is something that every professional would need to have ideally. So when we talk about, so this is very important. So when you come to looking at the particular competencies for the role that you're going to profile, we would advise you to not do more than 8 or 10, because it's not to say that these are not all relevant, and that they're not maybe 20 competencies that could be particularly relevant in the role. But when you role profile, you need to only describe what we call the mission critical competencies. So the mission critical competencies are those competencies that are absolutely essential to achieving the job purpose. So it's not saying that the other competencies aren't important, but that when you're describing the handful of core competencies for a role, you want to look at those mission critical competencies particularly. And you also want to look at to what extent they're aligned to the correct level of work, right? And we'll talk a little bit about that a bit later. Okay, so are competencies still useful? So there's been a lot of debate on competencies over the decades, with a lot of people saying competencies are dead and they've been renamed capabilities or agilities. There's various other words for it. Business typically doesn't really like the word competency because they don't often understand it. It's a little bit abstract. And I think part of what happened in the whole competency movement is that it got too complicated. People had many competencies for a role. It became hard to interview for many competencies. And it's interesting, I think it's not right because we only have 2 hours, we don't have a whole day for this, but I think really competencies are as relevant and useful as they ever were. If we call them agilities, if we call them capabilities, it's fine, it's the same thing. But it really does talk to those clusters of behaviors that enable people to apply their skills consistently at the right level. And as we know, they're very useful from an interviewing perspective as well. And we can also train from a training perspective as well. I mean, leadership, the whole movement, or the whole field of leadership development is really around those leadership, a set of competencies. So I think it's not to say it's the only things that are important, these competencies, because of course other things are important as well, but it's particularly important to define what those mission critical competencies are. Okay, so we've got a little bit of a case study here, and if we look at certain studies, so there's various studies. I didn't want to get too academic on you and put a whole lot of studies in, and many of them are white papers, not necessarily academic papers. But if we look at studies from organizations like McKinsey, Deloitte, etc., it's showing that up to 80% of hiring failures are due to behavioral competency gaps, not technical ability. So you can hire somebody, for example, who's a good industrial psychologist, as I'm sure you all are, right? But if the organization is very flexible, very go with the flow, and requires a very high level of ambiguity, that might not suit all of you. Or similarly, it might be very, very structured, very, very concrete, very, you might perceive a level of micromanagement in the level of structure that's needed. So it's important to be able to understand what are the core competencies for the role, how do the competencies link to what's important for the organization. And if you look at it, interestingly, so I just looked at some of these studies, and some of the most common derailers from a competency perspective are the fact that people, they can't be coached, they don't take feedback and learn from feedback, they don't manage stress, they don't communicate well, they don't take ownership, and they're not able to adapt to change. So these are just, some important competencies that it could be useful when you're doing your profile to look at in terms of what's particularly important. We expect these competencies to some extent to be automatic in some of the higher level roles. But I think, again, it talks to what is the purpose of the role, so that you can define for that role what are the mission critical, the core set of competencies that is going to be most important. And I think it's also linked to the fact that none of us is superhuman. Not all of us can do everything. So from a selection and an internal promotions perspective, you want to know that people are people kind of 70-80% there, because that gap is much easier to close than a bigger gap. So interestingly, we just gave you a little case study here about somebody being hired to build a culture of innovation, and they were hired purely on their technical expertise rather than their innovation skills. And it's a disguised true story, but it didn't work, and it created all kinds of issues for the person themselves. But of course, particularly when senior people don't have the right competencies at the right level, it creates various organizational challenges and problems as well. Okay, I'm moving to the next slide. Can you see it? Can you see?
Yep.
Is it moving? Okay. So in terms of if we're able to focus on the right competencies, what we get is we're able to hire much more precisely, we're able to measure performance more precisely, and we're also able to drive development much more precisely as well, because we can develop on so many things, but we can be very clear about what we need to develop in terms of what's core for the role. Okay, I'm moving on to the next slide here. Levels of work. Can you see?
Yep.
Okay. So we're talking here now you'll know this, right? So it seems like a silly question, right? What's the difference between a front desk security role and the role of CEO? And you think, well, there's a vast difference in education, in qualifications, in experience, in skills required, and so on. So if you look at it, both roles are actually equally vital. And if we had more time, we would ask you to break into groups and to look at what's similar. But they're actually equally vital. So without security, the business could be disrupted or unsafe. But without leadership, the business can lose direction and fail. So both roles protect the business, they manage risks, they need a level of decision making, particularly decision making under pressure. They both contribute to the business reputation. They work to prevent problems before they happen, and they also ensure business continuity. So interesting, you look at these roles and you think they're vastly different, but actually, if you think about how they're similar in these 6 very key ways. What, of course, is different, particularly, is the level of work. I'm hoping it's gone into the next slide here.
Yes.
You can see, okay, in terms of level of work, right? So a security guard or somebody, at that level of work is very concrete. It's very rule-oriented. It's very procedural. And typically the time frame for the scope of impact for decisions is very short. So it's very clear, very, very concrete, very rule-oriented, very structured. Whereas CEOs, although they may be doing these same things in terms of protecting the business in a different way, CEOs, the impact of their decisions is much longer, right? So they need to make decisions that require them to navigate ambiguity and familiarity, lack of structure. They need to be able to build relationships with diverse stakeholders at different levels. They need to be able to anticipate and respond well to market shifts. They need to be able to work well with data, to be able to understand what are the bigger picture, what are the trend lines in the business. So they absolutely cannot follow set structured procedures. So for them, they need a different level of thinking to be able to cut to the core of what's most important, to cut to the core of complexity. So the language that we use to describe the differences between these 2 roles, now it's interesting because the field of vertical development and adult development is a very big field. There's some very nice books on vertical development. That's a whole nother subject for another day. But the model that we particularly use, and as I say, I think most of you will be familiar with it because you will have encountered tools like the CPP and CPA, or the IRIS, which are derived, describe elements, not all, but some elements of SST. So SST is a model of levels of work complexity. For those of you, I feel like I'm preaching to the choir here, but for those of you, just to refresh also, so levels of work, it's a model of organizational complexity developed by a now dead Canadian organizational psychologist called Elliot Jacks. It's written Jacques here, you see, but it's pronounced Jacks. He wrote a whole lot of virtually unreadable books. The man struggled to cut to the core and write in an accessible way, but his theory is beautiful. And interestingly, his theory at first glance is not that much different from grading systems. So if we think about grading systems, Patterson, Task, Haber, Romney's, etc., grading systems talk about it's largely linked to pay, right? So it's largely linked to understanding the level of complexity, decision-making, leadership responsibility, etc., of different roles to be able to calibrate pay decisions, rewards decisions accordingly, right? And in Jacks's theory, as in all grading systems, higher levels typically correspond to greater decision-making, problem-solving, and longer-term planning. So at the most operational levels, work is concrete and rule-orientated. At the more senior levels, work becomes increasingly complex, ambiguous, unstructured, with wider and longer time frames. So here we have Elliot Jacks's first 5 levels. Of course, he originally came up with 7 and then he added an 8th level. But I'll tell you why we've only gone to level 5 here. And the CPP, as you know, only goes to level 5, although the CPA does go beyond from an assessment perspective. But if we look at these different levels, so level 1 is very quality focused, as I say, structural, rule orientated, our guard, our teller, call center operators, etc. Level 2 is so interesting because it's the service-focused level requiring informed thinking to interpret and apply known theory. So it's so interesting. It was one of the fascinating things that really struck me when I first learned this theory, is how a GP doctor, a general practitioner doctor, is at level 2. So as much as they would, certainly many of the cleverest people in my matric year went off to be doctors, but if you're a GP doctor aiming to try and see people every 15 minutes, what's the job? The job is to get the right information to be able to make and monitor a diagnosis. And if the patient doesn't present a set of symptoms that meet the algorithm, the correct thing to do, right, is to escalate to a specialist at level 3. So level 2 also talks, as much as it's GP doctors, it's also engineers, first line engineers, accountants, nurses, motor mechanics, would all function at a level 2 as well. Level 3 is the level of tactical best practice. So at level 3, there's a goal, but there's no clear method to get to a goal. That also really struck me as the difference between level 2 and 3. At level 2, there's a goal, but there's a clear method to get there. At level 3, there's a goal, but there's not necessarily one clear method. So it's the first level of independent judgment where people have to come up with criteria to be able to select and apply the best possible method, bearing in mind that there's no longer any one right answer. And each of these are linked to time frames. So whereas level 1 is very immediate, level 2 is maybe the doctor, for instance, would look at a patient over a few months. So typically we could, a lot of level 2 work could be is managed ultimately in terms of annual measures. Level 3, though, there's a requirement to think about this year, consider last year while planning for next year, so more that 1 to 2 year time frame. Level 4, the strategy execution level, there's a requirement now to think in terms of 2 to 5 year time frames, taking the organizational strategy and adapting it for the particular department. And then level 5 thinks 5 to 10 years. That's typically the executive, the C-suite within a company within one geography. So level 6 is C-suite of companies operating in multiple geographies or companies in organizations that work across multiple industries. And then level 7 and 8 are these people who are really redefining the future in new ways. How are we going to fly airplanes without fossil fuels, etc., thinking 20 to 50 to 100 years. And they're coming up with the things that are only going to become best practice in many decades to come, which is why for our purposes here. Yes, Colleen?
It's good news. It's not about technology. I was just wondering, like an Elon Musk, where would you put him?
I mean, it's so interesting, isn't it? And it actually talks to such an important theme of vertical development as well, is cognitively, there's no doubt he's level 7 or 8. I mean, talking about going to Mars, just unbelievably innovative, right? And I mean, out of the box thinking is a bit like a cliche for him. I mean, he's clearly a very brilliant man. Interestingly, though, if we look at these themes of vertical development, his emotional maturity and emotional regulation is not at the level of his cognitive thinking and his strategizing, which is quite interesting. So I think that also talks to the fact that Jax himself looked a lot at the cognitive aspects of level of work. He did mention some of the other aspects, but not enough. Whereas a full understanding of people's ability to operate at the right level actually talks to their ability to manage self, manage others, and manage business in a more holistic way. So people would need at least at benchmark strength across a wider range of competencies than Jax in fact prioritized. And it's interesting there because you think about tools like the CPP and the CPA, great tools. I mean, really clever, great tools, but they're only part of the picture. And I don't know, I'm sure some of you will have experienced people who come out level 4 on the CPP for a general management role. You think, fantastic, this person's thinking at the level, they're operating at level 4, but in fact they might not be. They might not be liberating that potential because they may be rigid, they may not listen, there may be a whole lot of other elements that interfere. So great question, Colleen. Yeah, and
Thank you.
I think really talks to an expanded understanding of levels of work beyond pure cognition. Yeah. Okay, I'm going on to the next slide. Let me see. Has it done it?
Yep.
Okay, so complexity isn't about working harder. It's really about the altitude at which people are looking at roles. So what do we mean by complexity? We talk about the time span of discretion. So how long does it take to recognize how long the time frame of decisions is in terms of measuring how successful they were, the number and nature of the variables involved, so the complexity in terms of being able to cut to the core and come up with what's relevant, the ability to process large amounts of information quickly and efficiently, and then the final one here being the ability to navigate increasing levels of ambiguity and uncertainty. So it's not about working harder, it's about managing longer time horizons, more variables, uncertainty, larger impact, and integration across functions and external constraints. So whereas really the last level at which you can really put your arms around a role and really control is probably the beginnings of level 3. After that, you know, the minute you go from senior manager upwards, there's a lot of increasing complexity that you cannot control. And it's important then, you know, you might say, why is this important for role profiling? It's important because we need to be able to make sure that we've calibrated the role profile to the correct level of the role and not to the person who's sitting in front of us from whom we might have got that role information. So you can see different roles at these different levels. Yes, Colleen.
No, I thought you were asking if the slide moved, but yes, it has.
It has moved. Good. Okay. So in an HR team, you can see here your chief HR officer, your chief people and culture officer would typically be around a level 5, maybe a high 4 for 5. You might have, and then you would have different roles at different levels. If you have somebody, a regional HR head or something, then they're called, of course, different titles. Titles are very misleading. Or the Americans would call it a vice president, right? Those would more be the level 4 roles, whereas your managers and senior managers would more be a 3. You'd have more of your kind of technical roles at a 2, and a level 1 would be your more administrative roles. This is another very important thing, another very important point to remember about role profiling, is that titles are extremely misleading. So here I'm talking to you from Malta at the moment. So I live and work between Malta and South Africa. And in Malta, their managers are actually general managers at level 4. So that really took me a while working with an insurance company here where their managers are actually level 4, but they're called HR manager or risk and compliance manager, but actually it's a level 4 role. So don't get too hung up. Really, we cannot go on the role profile because the role profile can mean wildly different things in different organizations. I mean, I'm working with the head of HR for Africa for a large ESG consultancy, and she's called a senior HR business partner. It's a level 4 role, whereas in other organizations that role would more be defined at a high 3, for instance. So don't get confused or bedazzled by the role title. You need to look at the content of the role to be able to understand its level of complexity and its level of seniority. Okay, I'm moving to the next slide here. I've spoken more or less about this. Did it click, Colleen?
Perfect.
Good.
I think it's working now. You don't need to check. It's fine. I don't
need to check. Okay,
yeah,
but you'll tell me if it's not. I'll tell you which slide I'm on so that you can just let me know then if it's not. Okay. So this is just a cheat sheet in terms of understanding levels of work. And it's good to put the levels of work descriptors into the profile. You can massage them into words that are relevant for your organization. But it's important for 2 big reasons. The one reason is it's important to understand where the role fits in the leadership cascade so that you can make sure that the complexity, the seniority of the role is calibrated into a proper structure, right? The second aspect is what we've been talking about, is to make sure that the flavor of the role in terms of the themes that you're using, what you're talking to in the role is at the right level. And there, as I say, it's easy to get it wrong when you're profiling somebody in the role who's not at the right level of the role, or who in some cases is actually at too high a level for the role. That's equally problematic. And I remember at Omnicor years ago when we first, with Hilton, we were looking at the level of complexity for hospital managers for one of the big healthcare groups. And they gave us a sample of hospital managers who were really doing brilliantly, a sample of some who were doing okay, but there was improvement, and another sample of some who were struggling. And it was so interesting because some of the people who had the highest levels on the CPP actually weren't doing well. They were too theoretical, too abstract. That what we discovered was the sweet spot for a hospital manager was somebody who was operating at a level 3, at a high level 3. That was the sweet spot, and too high was as problematic as too low. So just to be aware of that as well, and just gives you a little bit of an understanding of kind of how how these roles scale up in terms of that leadership cascade. Okay, and we'll do this just before we break for our break, as a nice section break, then we'll take our 10 minutes. So here we've given you a table that calibrates stratified systems theory levels of work to Patterson Classic. I know some companies put the 3, if we think about the specific Patterson grades. I know one of a company I was working with last week, actually they put the 3s in the upper rather than the lower, but that's not typical. So typical, you can see here, level 1 quite interestingly straddles Patterson A, B and C lower. And you can see how it's defined there in terms of primary operational and advanced operational work. Level 2 then would be the C4 and C5 roles, typically either first line supervisors or practitioners and technicians. The D lower would be your manager, typically D up is your senior manager, but it can also be a whole wide category of professionals and specialists. E band corresponds to SST4, our divisional managers, our general managers, and our group functional advisors, even though they may be called a whole range of different things. And then top management, C-suite, is typically then level 5. So you then have a kind of a clear understanding when even before you're doing your role profiling, your actual role profile, in terms of understanding how the cascade looks, and what's important in that. So hopefully you have some tools now that can guide you to do that. Should we take a 10-minute break? It's now 3 minutes past. Should we come back, Colleen?
Yes, perfect. Come back.
Yep, super. All good.
In 10 minutes.
In 10 minutes. Okay.
Perfect. Thank you.
Great.
Thanks.
Great.
See you ready now.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Cathy, you back?
I'm back. I'm
Great.
here. Can you see me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great.
That was wonderful. Thank you.
Good, I'm glad.
I see we've got an interesting comment from Moleklo. I hope I'm pronouncing that correct. Moleklo was particularly interested in your reference to Malta and working with the different clients, opening up some real interesting conversation about how different cultural and organizational context shape the levels of complexity required in various roles. And it would be fascinating to explore what patterns or trends emerge across countries and industries. Very SST vibe.
We can have another webinar
Yes.
on that. It is very interesting actually. And I think it's also interesting what AI is doing to levels of work as well. But it's interesting because it on the surface it's superficially speeding things up, but actually you know there's still some very important lessons I think in actually thinking longer term, and in some ways Jax's theories are even more relevant in an AI world actually. But very interesting, the cultural aspects, yeah, and the titles are so different. So we really can't go on titles.
Okay, I think we can get started.
Can we get started? Okay. Yep. Okay, so I'm just thinking now. So we've got basically, just in terms of a time check, we have, am I right? So Coral's going to just do the assignment at 5:02. Am I right? So I have, like 40 minutes we have. Hey?
Yes,
perfect,
that'll be good.
Perfect. Great. Okay, so let me click on here. So hopefully you've got some nice resources there that you can use in terms of understanding, making sure you've got your leadership cascade right, and making sure your roles are properly calibrated to the correct levels, right? And as I say, it's super important also in terms of guiding all your people decisions in an integrated way. Okay, can you see this slide on the balance scorecard?
Yeah.
Okay. So the balance scorecard, it's so interesting how they're fashions in organizations, and when you start to live long, you realize, oh my word, some things like that were big in the 90s, nobody knows what they are anymore, and yet they start to come back in different ways. So interestingly, the balance scorecard, some of you may or may not have heard of it. It was very big in the 90s and the early 2000s, and some organizations do still use it, but of course it's not being popularized and marketed like it used to be. So the balance scorecard, if you picture, a whole lot of those matryoshka dolls, I think you call them, those little Russian dolls that fit into each other. And what the balance scorecard what the balance scorecard is it's a framework for saying, if we set that biggest doll, right? We set the vision and the strategy for the organization as a whole. How does that then trickle down in terms of divisions, departments, teams, individuals, so that we make sure that our expectations of individuals and individual KPIs map comprehensively to that bigger picture organizational vision and strategy. And it sounds so obvious, it's often not done. So often the organizational vision and strategy set, and it gets a little bit like broken telephone, it gets more and more loosely translated by different people in different areas of the business. Whereas the balance scorecard made sure that was quite tight. And I know some of the big banks very much use a balance scorecard approach in their performance appraisal system. But what Kaplan and Norton spoke about, so this is really important for profiling, right, was they spoke about there being four areas. So any organization would have financial metrics, It would have customer and relationship metrics. So that would largely be external, right? External customer and relationship metrics. Learning and growth, learning, education and growth metrics, which is more around leadership and how we're developing and growing and retaining our people internally. And then our internal process metrics. So they talk about these 4 elements of the balanced scorecard. So any good role profile will have these 4 elements, right? Any role, even the most junior role, would have some kind of financial component. You might combine it with something else, but it would have some kind of financial component around not wasting, for instance, or displaying a level of cost consciousness. And then you can make sure that the metrics across roles are aligned also to the overarching objectives. So Kaplan and Norton came up with the philosophy of the balanced scorecard in the 90s. In our increasingly governed world, many organizations have added a risk aspect to that, and risk being, risk and compliance aspect. So what is the risk and compliance aspect of the role? It also can be helpful to pull out strategy and innovation, because it's not necessarily, it could be implied in business process, but if we don't pull it out specifically, we don't look at it. And it's no surprise, it's no secret to share Toyota, for example. Toyota has their Kaizen approach, in terms of driving continuous improvement, and they make sure that even the most junior person is held responsible for every quarter, not necessarily on their own, but it's possibly in pairs or trios, coming up with some idea around continuous improvement, and that's their whole Kaizen philosophy. But the nice thing is that's then a separate aspect of their role profile. So that would be the innovation piece in terms of how it would cascade. It can be helpful also in terms of learning and growth. Sometimes, for roles that don't manage people, it can be useful just to have a learning and growth aspect, and often that's linked to living the organization's values, etc. But it's useful to have a leadership piece separately as well. And then if it's a level 4 or a level 5 role, then it's very helpful to have a strategy piece too, just so that if you're thinking about designing your questions for a role, you are thinking about these 8 possible, we would call them buckets, right? So these are the buckets of the role. So you could say to the person, for instance, from a financial perspective, how does your role either contribute to bringing in money for the organization, or, as all roles do from a bottom line perspective, contribute to saving money through enhancing efficiencies, managing waste, etc., right? From a business process point of view, there could be a few elements of that you might break up into different buckets. If you think about an industrial psychologist's role, for instance, there's a number of processes you might be involved in. You might be involved in talent management, you might be involved in performance management, you might be involved in rewards or in well-being. So those would be different buckets that you would break down, right? And you would have a separate outputs. Customer stakeholder would be who are the external people that you need to. Now typically customer could be an internal customer, but it's external to your department, right? So it's not necessarily an external customer as in out in the world, but somebody external, somebody to whom you provide a service. And then from a learning and growth perspective, as I say, it overlaps with leadership, but it's useful if this role leads people. You could, ideally, you'd have like a slightly different narrative, a summarized narrative for the different levels of work, depending on the extent of leadership and what's required at those different levels. And risk, particularly in highly regulated industries like banking, etc., you would definitely want to put a risk bucket there as well. So this is at least telling you these are your headings, if you like, right? So I'm going on to the next slide here. You'll tell me if you don't see it. Now we're going into our application. So we've covered all of our theory. Now we're going into our application. So we start off with thinking about what do we need to prepare for the role. So you would schedule the 1-hour profiling interview with the incumbent. It's also helpful if their line manager is there too. Now, 1 hour is quite short, and that's ideally why you want to prepare for it, right? So you think about what could the role entail. You think about these different buckets of the balanced scorecard that I've just shared with you now, and you think about to what extent are those roles relevant. And if you think about it here, then you'd look at, does the role have leadership responsibilities? What is the level of the role? What's the level of risk that would be needed to manage, and how? What financial responsibilities would the role have? What would business processes typically look like in the role? And what could be expected from the role in terms of innovation? So these are some of the kinds of things that you would think of in terms of preparing. Okay, going to the next slide now as well. Just seeing my slides disappeared, Colleen, where people put up their hands. So if you can just tell me, is that okay?
Yes, no,
okay,
we're
just
good.
tell me, because that little window's disappeared for some reason.
Okay, no problem.
And I'm nervous to fiddle in case we lose something.
Okay.
So let's look at it here, right? So if we're looking at a profiling session, people are wired to resist change, and they often quite quickly go to a place of fear. So it's certainly my experience that particularly when we brought in from outside to profile roles in an organization, that it can often come with a lot of fear about why are you doing this, and could I potentially lose my job, or could my job be affected in some way? So if you're doing it internally to the organization, it's very important actually, from a buy-in perspective, to send a communication beforehand and to socialize it properly so that people understand this bit about how the role profile is at the heart of the whole HR value chain, and how HR actually can't build their house without it. It impacts everything from who you attract, how you recruit, select, develop, performance manage, career path, etc. And then when you explain it to people like that, then they understand it. But if you don't, they think, why are you speaking to me about my job, and what could that mean for me? When we're profiling as well, this is another important point to remember. So there's these little nuggets that we're talking about, right? So another nugget is that it's very important to profile the current ideal. So not the current, because the current may be a temporary fix in relation to, somebody having left and people doing different roles, or it could be relating to how it's always been but not how you want it to be. But it's also very important not to profile the future role, because that's too abstract, and then that's also not fair from an inherent job requirement perspective. We actually get into a little bit of legalities there. So we can't recruit and performance manage and pay people, measure people, but particularly also where pay is involved, against a role that is not the role that they're expected to do now. So it sounds silly, but this is an often asked question. Do we profile the future ideal of the role, or do we profile the role as it is right now? And we say no, we're profiling the current ideal. So we're profiling the role, as it should be right now. The role as it should be right now is what we're profiling. We start by asking, what is the overall purpose of the role? Why does the role exist? Now, this, interestingly, it's a deceptive question, because it's easy to overcomplicate or oversimplify, but really the purpose of the role is, where does it fit in the department as a whole, right? And what is the value that the role brings? So when we're talking about defining the purpose of the role, we typically don't want more than 2, at the most 3 sentences. And typically how you want to word it is, you want to word it to do ABC so that XYZ, right? So it's to manage kind of, I don't know, let's just make something up, to manage kind of well-being and the talent management ecosystem so that we're able to get the best out of our people. So it's what are you doing and why are you doing it, if that makes sense. So a good job purpose will have a what and a why. What you might also do with it is you might have just a few bullets, not too many, but just a few bullets defining some of the overarching themes of the role. You're not going to write the whole job profile in that. And for our purposes, we prefer that you just write the purpose as typically what does the role need to do and why. As I said, maybe 3 sentences. If you really want to add like three bullets or so, do that. But we don't want to make it too complex. You know, and we also just don't want to talk about the what. We want to talk about the value that brings, right? Then also in terms of the background aspect of it, you're looking at what is the minimum qualification. So typically you would look at what's the minimum qualification for the role and what does the role require. Now sometimes different organizations have different philosophies around this, but sometimes it's okay if you are busy, if you registered for the degree, even if you haven't finished. So for instance, if a role says you must have an MBA, but the person is busy with their MBA, that is by many companies regarded as okay because they know that they will get it. Well, we hope that they'll get it, right? So anyway, you can decide around that. Interestingly, and just to this insight that Colleen raised in the chat, one of the big things that I've noticed, a big difference between South Africa and working into Europe from Malta, is interestingly they're much less concerned here about degrees, strangely. You would think that Europe would be very concerned about degrees, but they're actually more practically oriented, actually. So for them, if you've got a diploma or you've got the certifications, I mean, we know, of course, that's very true in IT as well, that's often deemed to be enough. It's more around the experience and how you apply your skills. Whereas in South Africa, I think it's difficult, you know, but I think we almost overemphasize the degree aspect, actually. But that's also a debate for another day. But it's thinking about what's a practical qualification that we need this person to have, and you know, but what's more important often is how have they applied it. I think the biggest danger there is that we can sometimes overinflate that because somebody has the master's or the PhD, we automatically assume they will, you know, the PhDs particularly, that they, you know, they breathe different air. But in fact, it's, you know, we could in the process be missing out on somebody who, let's say, has an honours degree, but who's much more of a workhorse and much more of a fit with the team, for instance. And even some of the other roles where we might think we need a degree, think about it, do you really need a degree? You know, what's involved there. I'm thinking particularly of roles like facilities management and these types of roles, often where certain certifications, provided they're with the right experience, could be enough, right? So then we're going to talk about minimum experience as well. Now, one of the things that's important here is in terms of your leadership cascade that we're talking about, you want to have it pretty much standardized across those different levels. So both in South Africa and in Europe, actually, there's been quite a big focus over the years. Of course, it comes and goes based on, you know, where the penalties are, you know, if you're going to be in breach, but around equal pay for equal work. So as far as possible, I mean, there may be good reasons why not, but as far as possible, you know, what kind of experience would you be looking at in your, if we think about Patterson, your A level, B, C lower, C upper, etc. How many years of experience, of relevant experience, would you want to be able to calibrate that? So, but ideally, you know, you don't want to be making it up in the session. You want to have some kind of structure that you can rely on around what that looks like at different levels. And as I say, then when it comes to things like equal pay for equal work, you've built your house correctly from the start. So you're aligned. It also makes sense, right, in terms of promoting people. Did I see somebody's hand up?
Yes, I think there's a great question from Ashley here, Cathy, if we can just get your view on it. When deciding on qualifications in the role profile, should we take barriers to employment equity?
I mean, I think, yes, but more than anything, yes, I mean, you do want to consider anything that could have made it particularly difficult for somebody to get a degree. So, for instance, if you're talking about general management, for instance, and the requirement is an MBA, and because of unequal access, somebody's clearly demonstrated the ability, but they don't have an MBA, I think there would be a very good reason to consider employing, even although the person might not fit the sort of cold hard requirements. There is something else here though, and that is that more than anything, the purpose of a good role profile is to find the right person for the role, right? Now, that's not just for the company, it's also for the individual. Because where we bring somebody into the role, and that's where assessments and skills tests and all these things help, right? But where we bring somebody into a role where they're not actually at the level of the role, it can cause them significant harm in terms of mental health, in terms of confidence, etc. So it's a bit of a kind of cruel to be kind thing sometimes, that we can really like somebody in an interview, and let's say, from an employment equity perspective, we're really keen in terms of our numbers to make sure that it's somebody from a previously disadvantaged group. But there are a lot of people in SA. It's not like here in Malta where the population's 500,000 and they're tearing their hair out because they just don't have, there's just not enough humans to do the jobs. In SA they are, and it's worth looking. Try not to settle with somebody who doesn't have at least the core competencies for the role at the right level. And yes, in terms of experience can be very misleading as well, right? Because when we say we want 10 years experience, is it actually 10 years or is it 1 year 10 times? It's different. Yes, Colleen.
Oh, just because this is exactly what's been asked in the chat, and then also just to let you know, it's 25 to 3. So the question is, why are entry jobs now asking for 3 to 4 years of experience, which is just to your point that you're making?
I mean, it just doesn't make, I mean, that's crazy, right? So that just makes no sense. It makes no sense. I mean, I think that's where organizations making more use of internships is so helpful. Because internships gives you work experience without permanent employment, but you can learn on the job. It's also for the company less risky and great for the country, right? I mean, in terms of transformation, giving people jobs and opportunities to learn and acquire skills. There's it's a very important thing that ideally all organizations are doing. But you're absolutely right. For entry-level roles, 3 to 4 years experience just does not make sense. But then it would also talk to, which is another aspect of the HR value chain and another aspect of why role profiles are so important, right, is it talks to inductions. Inductions and orientations across the world are typically not done well enough. So how, if it's an entry-level role particularly, rather slow down to speed up and give people a little bit of a longer induction, because that then gives them the vision and a good place to start. Yeah, I'm just aware of time. Oh my word, we could have all afternoon here. So then you also want to look at the internal and external stakeholders in the role. You don't want to look at an exhaustive list of everybody, but you want to look at who primarily does this role need to liaise with, both internally and externally, to do their job, right? So who does the role need to liaise with internally and externally to do their job? So that is the background then that you would need for the role. Okay, I'm going on to the next slide. I'm hoping that you are seeing it. So part 2 is the content, right? So this is the hard part this is the part people most struggle with typically, because it's a bit like learning to drive a car, and there are a few gears and there's some dashboards and you've got to kind of just get your head around it. Once you've got it, it's much easier. Is you want to look at your buckets, right? So you want to think, so you typically start with business processes. And you typically start with what are your primary responsibilities, what do they entail, what are the specific behaviors or activities that you perform regularly, are there workflows you must follow, what are the key steps involved. One of the things also when you're writing your role profile is to start every sentence with a verb. So in Afrikaans the verb is a werkwoord, it's such a nice description of a verb. So started with a verb. So demonstrate, display, analyze, present. I've given you some of Bloom's taxonomy verbs as a last slide. But try and start it with a verb because it makes it much easier. Then you want to think about what financial responsibilities do they have, what financial metrics are they responsible for in the role. It could just be at a lower level. It can just be cost consciousness, right? And do you develop or manage any budgets, or do you participate in the budget process? Then you could talk about risks. What types of risks are you most concerned with here in your position? How do you identify potential risks? And what strategies do you implement to mitigate identified risks, right? So these are some of the questions you could ask here. Please touch on risk. It's a very important, when Kaplan and Norton, I think, were operating in a more innocent world, whereas the risk load has increased dramatically in the last 25 years. So do ask about risk. And, if you think about most organizations have risk and compliance in some or other form. Then from a stakeholder perspective, what do you do to build and maintain strong relationships with stakeholders? It could just be 2 or 3 lines here. How regularly do you need to meet with stakeholders? How does your approach to engaging with internal stakeholders differ from that of external stakeholders? So these are some of the kinds of questions you can ask here. Then in terms of leadership roles, those roles where there's a leadership aspect, what is expected of you in terms of leadership, and how do you identify and nurture the strengths of your team? From a strategy point of view, if it's a level 4 or level 5 role, in other words, a Patterson E or an F-band role, start with strategy. It would be important to start with strategy. How does this role contribute to the organization's long-term success? What decisions, initiatives, or innovations in this role have a direct influence on its competitive advantage or future direction? So again, you don't need to write a lot, but you need to try and capture it in terms of what are the key behaviors here. Then also in terms of innovation, what's the expectation in terms of innovation? How do you stay informed about industry trends and emerging technologies? So that's also important. If you think of, you think about Toyota's byline, everything keeps going right, Toyota, right? It used to be on their adverts. I don't know if I'm really showing my age here. But part of it is that they have embedded a culture of optimization from the most junior levels up. And so it's important, in our volatile, uncertain, complex world. I know there's this new acronym, Barney, saying we live in a brittle, anxious, non-linear and incomprehensible world. But if we think about the massive changes that are coming about through AI, through very turbulent global politics, etc., we do need people to think with a little bit more of an optimization mindset. We do need them to show initiative and to be a bit more proactive. So you might want to probe what that looks like in the role. And then in terms of learning and growth, again, probably a very short section, but what are your ongoing learning and professional development expectations? You can write them quite crisply. And how do you access and share critical knowledge within your team? So here you've really got the universe of what you need to consider from a role profiling perspective. Can you, has it moved?
Yes.
So you're saying, why can't we just use Gen AI? Well, you can use one of these Gen AI platforms to help you think better, but you can't get it to think for you. And I think that's where we're coming also to in our understanding of Gen AI. Use Gen AI to think better, but not to do your thinking for you, because it can often be wrong. It can often be imprecise, and if the profile is a generic off-the-shelf profile full of those, long dashes, the Oxford commas, all of the wording as well, it's a good bit of it's very probably not relevant. So you need to use it as I say, a thinking partner, not to think for you. So it's, and I think also, if you think, right, just think about the importance of it now. If you think that the job profile is at the heart of the whole people value chain, typically organizations spend more on people than anything else. And then they want to go into ChatGPT and for 5 minutes get a job profile that defines the massive investment they're going to make in bringing a person into their organization. I mean, if you think about a financial accountant or a financial manager, every organization needs that. Why would a candidate want to work for you? And what does the job look like in your environment? You can't just use a generic standardized approach. So we need to bring in the organization's culture, strategy, unique operational needs. Ideally, you'd want to take the structure that Omnicor is giving you and kind of make something beautiful out of it. We've got David on the call here in marketing, who does very beautiful things with Omnicor's information. Just make the role profile into something exciting, something visually exciting and aspirational, right? So AI also doesn't understand the internal structures, the naming conventions, the reporting lines, the company's evolving needs. Right? You could also if you're feeding too many organizational insights, we know that anything we put anywhere out there is in public domain at some level. We also don't know that it necessarily complies with the local laws, and it can get things wrong, and it can hallucinate, as you know, and make things up. And it also doesn't necessarily look in terms of the leadership cascade. And interestingly, I mean, I do use it as a thinking partner quite often. And around levels of work, it can get it very wrong. And I've got to come to it and say, no, it's not that. And then it says, no, sorry, you're right. So be careful. Use it, as I say, as a thinking partner, but you're driving, not it. Okay, our next slide here is the actual writing of the profile. Is read through your notes to familiarize yourself with the content. So typically, I occasionally, depending on the role, I might type it straight into the format, but typically I would actually, use a Word document to just type it under the different buckets there, highlight key themes, phrases that stand out, because you also don't know around. So you can take however you like to do it, take the Omnicor template and turn it into particular questions with a flow for you, so that you know that if they go into another section, you can jump around and put it in different places without trying to over-manage your template in the profiling session. So you want to look for the key outputs of the role, use the BSC, the balanced scorecard metrics, to guide you, and you'd group similar outputs together where possible. Then for each output, and the template does guide you around this, you'd identify the key behaviors, starting with a verb, right? And then you'd look at the measurable indicators. So we could call these success measures, we call them KPIs, key performance indicators. Sometimes they're called key result areas, KRA. So a KRA is the same as a KPI, is the same as a success measure. And you'd want to consider both qualitative and quantitative measures. So just a little note there. A quantitative measure would be achieves more than 90%. The engagement surveys in their area are higher than 90%. That would be quantitative, right? A qualitative metric would be something like positive stakeholder satisfaction, positive perceptions. so a qualitative measure is not necessarily as easy to measure as a hard measure, but equally useful to put qualitative measures in as well. And then you also want to, when you've profiled certain roles within a particular department, you want to look and see, with the line manager, you want to look and see, do all these KPIs add up to what the department as a whole is being measured on? And that also then talks back to our balanced scorecard philosophy, right? So for each KPI, you might include some target outcomes, you might include timelines, you want to try and make it as crisp and as practical as possible. And remember, you want it to be thorough, and you wanted to have the necessarily detail, but without being overly detailed, right? And then you're going to identify the top 6 to 8 mission critical competencies. So remember, I like this term mission critical competencies. I actually remember doing work at Omnicor years ago. I mean, it was the early 2000s at one of the big banks, and I learned it from them, this idea of mission critical competencies. But I really love it because, yes, 27 competencies might apply, but for the purposes of the role profile and the purposes of interviewing, performance management, career pathing and succession, etc., you want to know what are the 6 to 8 mission critical competencies that are essential in the role. And then also, you want to also just look at, are there any particular industry standards that we need to be aware of that are emerging? So you think about, for example, POPIA, the Protection of Personal Information Act. That impacted many roles, right? It impacted, obviously, from a risk and compliance, but in terms of what you do with customer data, in terms of what you do with employee data, etc. So you want to think, are there industry standards, regulations that apply, so that our profile can be a little bit aspirational as well, in terms of maybe thinking beyond how we've always done it, to think about how can we do it even better. So just some tips as we end here, and then I'm gonna hand over to you, Carl, in a minute. I'm just thinking, I've got just 2 more slides quickly here. So it's just some tips here. So when writing out the key behaviors under each output, as I said, start each sentence with a verb, a Werkwoord. It really makes it easier. It really does. Because sometimes the person's telling you, you say, what is the verb? Is it present? Is it display? Is it analyze? What is the verb? Aim for brevity while ensuring all essential information is included. Profiles should be informative but not overly lengthy. Consider who will be reading the profile and the information that they find valuable. Interestingly, historically, pre-COVID and hybrid and remote work, profiles were more kind of HR thing, and they were more sort of wheeled out when you needed to interview or, at performance appraisal time. Now, they are becoming increasingly valuable tools for the person themselves in the role, understanding what does the role look like, what does good look like, how am I spending my time and how am I showing up, so that people can then manage themselves better. So don't just rely on acronyms, define what they mean. So even things like, we know what KPIs mean, but I promise you not everybody in business does. So we can't just assume it. So where you use an acronym, and if you're using it over and over again, define it at the beginning of the document. Like ROI, for instance, ROI, return on investment, could be a very nice success measure for certain things. We know what it means, but not everybody does. And we, it's a much better profile if we've kind of explained what some of those mean. So include both the technical and the soft skills, so the technical competencies and the behavioral competencies for success in the role, and make sure they align with the organization's values and goals. And ideally, you want to find somewhere in the profile where you're putting those values. Often it's in the learning and growth section. And then check for grammatical errors, typos, and clarity. And the reason for that is it's the same as psychometric reports. If there are errors in the presentation of it, people assume there are errors in the content. So that's why that quality excellence orientation is key. And then just a last slide from me as I hand over to Coral, to you and then Colleen to close, is here's Bloom's taxonomy. So it's not directly relevant to role profiling. It comes more from an educational, it's more used in an educational context where teachers are kind of understanding kind of different learning levels. But what's very nice is it does talk about different levels of thinking. So at the simplest levels, we remember, we understand, we apply, we analyze, we evaluate, we create. So just thinking about, it's nice lists of verbs around, if somebody's creating or they're building or they're changing or they're composing or they're designing. You have a bit of a list of verbs here as well as some categories to be able to locate them. So there we go. It's a lot of information. I know it's you will have the presentation, and as Colleen was saying, it's really in the application of it that you'll work out what you know and what you don't know. And then we have our second session in December to be able to bring it all together in terms of what you find easy, what you find maybe more difficult, and what kind of support would be helpful for you going forward.
Thank you, Cathy.
Coral, shall I stop sharing and you want to share on your side, or shall I just put it on the last slide?
You can still share, Cathy. Thank you.
I can still share or stop share?
No, you can still share.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so this is just a standard checklist for you for what a good profile is. It describes everything we've already spoken about. And here's the assignment, Coral, for you.
Thank you so much, Cathy. Okay, so in terms of the assignment, you will each be paired with another IOP from today's session, or IOP Intern, and then the pairing list will be shared with you after the webinar. So it's important to just choose a real person to profile. So together with your partner, choose someone in a real work environment. This person will be the subject of your profile. And then you'll need to set up an interview. So schedule an interview with the person you selected. You and your partner can take turns asking questions. And then in terms of completing the job profile template, you'll use the interview information just to fill in one job profile template as a pair. So work together so the profile is complete and accurate. And after drafting the profile, go through it again with your partner, check for accuracy, clarity, and just make sure it's completed before submitting. So each pair needs to submit one final job profile to me by the 5th of December, close of business. And we will aim to give you the feedback by the 10th of December. But if not, please expect the feedback by the 15th to the 19th of December. So in terms of the follow-up session on the 10th of December, Cathy will go through any common themes or gaps seen across all of the submissions. And this will just help you understand good practice and improve further. All needed documents will be included in the presentation, and I will also attach the competency library as well as a template, an example template just to help you. So take your time, but just make sure to meet the deadline and collaborate well with your partner and just enjoy the learning experience.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Coral. I think there will also be a prize as nominated by Cathy as to whose profile is the best. Still to be decided. Thank you both, Coral and Cathy, and thank you, David, for setting everything up. It's been so wonderful to see you all and meet you all. We do see your questions in the chat, and Cathy will answer them for you and we'll add it to the deck. Good luck, and reach out if you have any questions you want to ask us.
Great, thank you. Lovely to meet all of you, albeit virtually, and Colleen as always, and Coral. But Colleen, as always, an absolute privilege and honor to work with you. Thank you.
Thanks, Colleen. Thanks, David.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.